The large lecture hall at the University of Michigan buzzed with low chatter. Pages flipped, laptops clicked open, and the soft rustle of backpacks echoed as students prepared for another tough day. Everyone knew this wasn't just any class. This was her class. The moment the professor walked in, the room went still. She was sharp, strict, and famous for her no-nonsense attitude. One glance from her could silence even the loudest student. Most people in that room were already bracing themselves, ready to survive another grueling lecture. But what none of them realized was that this ordinary morning would turn into something unforgettable. Because hidden among those students was one quiet young man who was about to change the way the entire class and even the professor herself saw things forever. Word of Daniel's unexpected brilliance spread across campus faster than wildfire. By the end of that week, people who had never spoken to him before suddenly knew his name. Some offered nods of respect when he walked by. Others whispered about the day he stood up to the toughest professor in the department and didn't just survive. He excelled. The professor herself wasn't done. A week later, she stood before the class and announced that Daniel had been recommended to represent the university in an upcoming mathematics symposium. She made it sound like an honor, but Daniel knew it was also another test. If he failed in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the best young mathematicians in the country, the story of his classroom victory would fade. People would remember the failure instead, and maybe, just maybe, that was what she wanted. Still, Daniel accepted, not out of pride, but because he refused to let anyone else write his story. The symposium was held at the University of Pennsylvania, inside a massive auditorium. Rows of competitors sat at desks with nothing but scratch paper, pens, and a digital clock ticking down from the wall. Daniel glanced around at the other contestants, students from elite universities, some already pursuing PhDs. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Somewhere in the crowd, the professor sat silently watching, her expression unreadable. The competition began with mental math, lightning-fast problems with no room for hesitation. While some contestants froze, Daniel's answers flowed almost instantly. The second round tested theoretical understanding, breaking down complex ideas into step-by-step logic. For Daniel, this was like breathing. He didn't see equations as lines of numbers. He saw patterns, rhythms, connections. Every step unfolded naturally in his mind. By the third round, only a handful of competitors remained in serious contention. Daniel was one of them. The pressure intensified. The problems grew heavier, layered with traps designed to break focus. Whispers spread in the audience as Daniel kept climbing the scoreboard. He barely noticed. His world had narrowed to paper, pen, and the steady rhythm of numbers. Finally, the last round arrived. Only two competitors stood at the top, Daniel and a PhD student from MIT, a man years older and far more experienced. The final problem flashed onto the screen. It was monstrous. Layers of nested integrals and summations stretched across the page. The kind of problem meant to humble even the most skilled mathematicians. Daniel stared at it for a moment, then exhaled. His pen touched the paper and his mind began to unravel the maze. The MIT student wrote furiously beside him. The room was so quiet that the sound of scratching pens echoed. Seconds dragged like hours. The clock ticked down. Halfway through, Daniel's eyes caught a subtle pattern, a hidden shortcut. It was the kind of insight you couldn't teach, the kind that came only from intuition and absolute focus. His hand moved faster, simplifying what seemed impossible into something clean, elegant, inevitable. He boxed the final answer with only seconds to spare. The buzzer sounded. Daniel leaned back, breathing steady. His competitor was still writing when the time ran out. Judges walked across the stage, checking each solution line by line. The silence in the hall was unbearable. Then one judge raised the microphone and declared the winner, Daniel Reed. The auditorium erupted in applause, gasps, even a few cheers. But Daniel didn't raise his hands in triumph. He simply let out a long breath. It wasn't about beating anyone else. It was about proving to himself more than anyone that he could rise when tested. From her seat, the professor stared at him. For once, her sharp expression softened. She didn't clap, she didn't smile. But she gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. That was enough. The next morning, back in the same lecture hall, the professor addressed the class. Her voice was calm but different somehow. "Before we begin," she said, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium. Daniel Reed took first place against some of the brightest minds in the country. That is no small achievement." The room fell quiet. A few students clapped. Some turned to look at Daniel with newfound respect. He nodded slightly, saying nothing. And then, as if nothing unusual had happened, the professor turned back to the board. "Now," she said, "let's begin." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't praise. But it was recognition. And in that moment, Daniel realized he didn't need more. Because sometimes, the greatest victories don't come with parades or loud celebrations. They come in the quiet shift of how people see you. And Daniel had changed that forever. The professor's chalk moved quickly across the board, her writing sharp and precise, each symbol landing with authority. She spoke in a clipped, confident voice as though every word she said was final. For most of the students, it felt less like a class and more like a test of endurance. Pens scratched desperately against paper, trying to keep up. Some had already fallen behind, staring at the board with blank expressions, their eyes glazed over. A few simply copied line after line without even trying to understand what they were writing. That was the way it usually went in her class. You survived by memorizing and hoping for the best. But there was one student who didn't look overwhelmed at all. Daniel sat quietly in the middle rows, a worn notebook open in front of him. Unlike the others, he wasn't rushing. His hand rested on his pen, tapping it lightly against the page in a steady rhythm. His expression was calm, almost detached, as if the blizzard of equations on the board was nothing more than background noise. To anyone looking at him, Daniel seemed like an ordinary student, maybe even uninterested. He wasn't the type to raise his hand, argue, or draw attention. He kept his hood up most days, spoke little, and blended into the background. But behind that quiet exterior was a mind that worked differently. Numbers and patterns didn't confuse him. They settled into place almost like pieces of a puzzle clicking together without effort. While the professor explained the concept of Laplace transforms, Daniel's eyes moved quickly over the board. He noticed things others didn't, the way one symbol connected to another, the rhythm hidden inside the complexity. It wasn't just memorization for him. It was instinct, like hearing music and instantly recognizing the tune. Still, he stayed quiet. That was how he preferred it. Let others chase the professor's approval, raise their hands or stumble through answers under her stern gaze. Daniel wasn't there for praise. He wasn't there to prove himself. He just wanted to learn in peace, but that peace never lasted long in this class. The professor thrived on control. She enjoyed the pressure, the silence, the way students grew nervous whenever she paused and scanned the room. It was her way of reminding them that she was in charge. She had built her reputation on being tough, and no one ever dared to challenge her authority. As she continued writing, Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. Something was off. A small detail, almost invisible, but he saw it right away. There was a mistake buried in the professor's work, a misplaced term, one that would change the result entirely. He tapped his pen again, debating what to do. Most students hadn't noticed. Some were too busy copying, others too intimidated to question her. Daniel had been in this position before, sitting silently while mistakes went unchecked. But this time he wasn't sure he could let it slide, because he knew exactly what would happen. At some point, the professor would circle back, catch the error herself, and correct it. No one would say anything, and she'd move on as if nothing had happened. Daniel hesitated. Speaking up could draw unwanted attention. It could even embarrass her, and that was dangerous in a class like this. The professor wasn't the kind to laugh off mistakes. She was the kind who made sure no one forgot their place. Still, the error scratched at the back of his mind. He hated seeing something wrong and letting it sit there, especially when the answer was so clear. He sighed softly and looked back at the board. His pen tapped once more against the page. He hadn't decided yet, but a choice was coming. And whether he liked it or not, the decision he made in that moment would change the way everyone in that hall remembered him. The classroom had fallen into its usual rhythm. Chalk against board, pens scratching paper, the faint hum of the projector. But then it broke. From the front row a hand went up. A girl, sitting stiffly with her notebook open, cleared her throat. Her voice was careful, almost apologetic. Professor, I think there's a small mistake in the second line." For a heartbeat, the room froze. Every student turned just slightly. eyes flicking toward the professor. Questioning her work wasn't something people did. The professor slowly turned, her expression unreadable at first. Then her brow arched as though the very suggestion was an insult. She adjusted her glasses, gave the board a quick glance, and shook her head. "There is no error," she said flatly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. The girl's cheeks flushed red. She lowered her hand instantly, staring down at her notebook. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the room, not loud enough to be obvious, but enough to sting. The professor turned back to the board, smirking faintly as though the matter was settled. But in the middle rows, Daniel exhaled slowly. He'd seen the same error clear as day, and he hated this, hated the way professors like her dismiss students without even listening. He tapped his pen against his notebook again, harder this time. His mind raced. He could stay quiet. That was the safe choice. It wasn't his problem after all. But the equation on the board gnawed at him as if daring him to speak. If no one said anything, the mistake would sit there, poisoning the whole lecture. And the way the professor had brushed off the other student, it lit a spark of defiance in him. Before he even realized it, his hand was in the air. The movement drew immediate attention. Heads turned. Whispers stirred. Daniel never spoke in class. He was the quiet one, the one who melted into the background. Yet here he was, arm raised steadily, eyes calm. The professor's chalk stopped mid-stroke. She turned her head, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Yes?" she asked, her voice low but laced with challenge. Daniel spoke clearly without hesitation. "Actually, there is an error." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the awkward pause that came when someone asked a silly question. It was sharper, heavier, filled with curiosity and surprise. Students twisted in their seats to get a better look. The professor didn't move right away. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Irritation, maybe even disbelief. Then she crossed her arms, tilting her head ever so slightly. "Oh?" she said, her tone calm but edged with steel. "Enlighten me." The words weren't an invitation. They were a dare. Daniel could feel dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. He rose slowly from his seat. Not out of arrogance, not to make a scene, but simply because it felt wrong to explain while slouched at a desk. His voice remained steady as he pointed toward the board. "It's in the second step," he said. The transformation was applied to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using that method, the final answer doesn't match what it should be. The room was utterly still. Even the usual hum of whispered side conversations had died. All that remained was the professor's rigid stance and Daniel's calm explanation. For the first time in years, someone had not only questioned her, but done so with confidence. Her jaw tightened. She turned back to the board, scanning the lines of her own work. Her grip on the chalk stiffened as her eyes caught the flaw. It was small, almost invisible, but Daniel was right. She had made a mistake she had just denied. The students watched with wide eyes, some leaning forward in disbelief. They could see it too now, the tiny error that changed everything. The professor's lips pressed into a thin line. She inhaled, then turned back toward Daniel, her voice cool and controlled. "Well, Mr. Reed," she said, her words slow and deliberate, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" The tension cracked into scattered chuckles across the room. A few students exchanged glances, some smirking, others almost pitying him. Everyone knew what this meant. This wasn't recognition, it was a trap. The professor wasn't asking him to explain. She was daring him to fail, and Daniel knew it. He set down his pen, his notebook sliding shut with a quiet thud. Then he stood, calm and deliberate, and walked toward the front. His steps echoed faintly in the silence, the weight of the room pressing in on him. What the professor didn't know was that by challenging him, she had just set something in motion that no one would ever forget. Daniel walked slowly to the front of the lecture hall, his footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. The air felt heavier now, charged with curiosity and quiet anticipation. Dozens of eyes followed him, some doubtful, some amused, some quietly rooting for him to fail. The professor stood to the side, arms crossed, her gaze sharp as glass. She didn't bother hiding her smirk. To her, this wasn't about the mistake anymore. This was about control. Daniel reached the board and paused, chalk in hand. It felt oddly heavy, though not from nerves. He wasn't afraid. What he felt was the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction. The professor, the classmates, the silence. He knew what they were thinking. He was about to embarrass himself. He was about to prove that he'd been reckless for speaking up. But Daniel didn't flinch. He lifted the chalk and carefully erased the professor's flawed step. His handwriting wasn't as neat as hers. His lines tilted slightly, his symbols not quite as crisp. But his movements were deliberate, sure. He began rewriting the equation from the point of error, speaking as he worked, not with drama, not with arrogance, but with calm clarity. The mistake was in how the transform was applied, he explained, his voice even. The coefficient can't be carried outside this early. Doing so shifts the limits and changes the integrity of the function. If you solve it that way, the final result doesn't match what it should. His words were steady, but every student was listening as though he were reciting a secret no one else knew. Heads tilted, notebooks lay forgotten for a moment. Even the sound of pens scratching had stopped. The only noise in the room was the soft rhythm of chalk against the board. Line after line appeared beneath his hand. Each step made sense, flowing naturally into the next, like water finding its way down a stream. He didn't stumble, didn't hesitate. He was too focused on the numbers, too wrapped in the quiet rhythm of solving. When he reached the end, he underlined the final answer with a single stroke. Then he set the chalk down gently, wiped his hands on his jeans, and turned around. The silence was suffocating. The professor's expression didn't change, but the tightness around her jaw was impossible to miss. She looked back at the board, eyes scanning his work line by line, searching for any crack, any flaw she could seize upon. But the equation stood firm. Daniel's correction wasn't just valid. It was clean, precise, undeniable. Some students glanced at each other with wide eyes. A few whispered under their breath. One student in the back let out the faintest chuckle, quickly stifled. They all knew what had just happened. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply walked back to his seat, his face calm, his steps measured. He had no interest in showing her up. To him, it wasn't about pride, it was about fixing what was wrong. The professor finally turned, her face composed but her eyes hard. "Fine," she said curtly. "You corrected it. Congratulations." The words hung in the air, flat and hollow, carrying none of the weight of genuine acknowledgement. It was the kind of statement that sounded polite on the surface but stung beneath it. Some students shifted in their seats, exchanging looks. They had expected her to at least give him credit, maybe even respect. But she brushed it aside as though his effort meant nothing. Daniel didn't react. He picked up his pen, flipped open his notebook, and quietly returned to his rhythm as if nothing had happened. But deep down he knew this wasn't over. The look in the professor's eyes said it all. This wasn't the end of the test, it was only the beginning. The class hadn't even recovered from the shock of Daniel's correction when the professor picked up the chalk again. Her movements were sharper now, her strokes harder against the board. She wiped away the solved equation almost violently, as if erasing the memory of her mistake. Without a word, she began writing again. This time the problem stretched farther across the board, line after line of symbols, integrals, and limits. It wasn't the kind of problem they had been working on that week. It wasn't even the kind of problem most undergraduates were expected to solve at all. This was something else. Something bigger, more complex, designed not to teach but to test. Students leaned forward in their chairs, some whispering quietly. They knew what was happening. This wasn't part of the lesson plan. This was a challenge. When the professor finally stepped back, she turned to Daniel, her arms folded tightly across her chest. A faint, almost mocking smile touched her lips. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall, "why don't you solve this?" The room stirred with quiet energy. Some students looked at Daniel with pity, others with curiosity. A few, the competitive ones, smirked as if waiting to see him fall flat on his face. Daniel sat still for a moment, staring at the massive equation sprawling across the board. He knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a regular exercise. It was meant to overwhelm him, to expose him as a fraud in front of everyone. If he hesitated, if he stumbled even once, the professor would win back control. She'd prove her authority and the class would fall back in line. He exhaled slowly, then pushed his notebook aside. The scraping sound of his chair echoed as he stood. His steps were steady as he made his way back to the front, the murmurs of his classmates following him. The professor stepped back, smirk widening. "Take your time," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. But Daniel didn't need time. He picked up the chalk, staring at the board for only a brief second before his hand began to move. The first few strokes were clean, decisive. There was no hesitation in his handwriting, no faltering in his logic. One line led into another and another, each step unraveling the complexity in front of him. At first, the room buzzed quietly, the sound of soft whispers bouncing between rows. But as Daniel worked, the noise faded. His concentration was so intense, so steady that it silenced the audience. The only sound that remained was the chalk scratching rhythmically against the board. Halfway through, Daniel stopped briefly, tilting his head at the equation. The professor leaned forward slightly, ready to pounce. But Daniel only turned his head and asked almost casually, "I assume you want the solution in exponential form, not trigonometric?" The professor's smirk faltered for just a second. She didn't respond. Daniel nodded to himself, turned back, and kept writing. His mind was 3-4 steps ahead of his hand. He wasn't thinking about whether he would succeed. He already saw the answer forming in his head like a picture coming into focus. His only task was to transfer it to the board before time ran out. The final lines fell into place, neat and sure. He underlined the solution, set the chalk down gently, and stepped back. Silence. For a long, heavy moment, the entire room sat frozen. Students blinked at the board, then at Daniel, then back again. Some mouths hung slightly open. It wasn't just that he had solved the problem, it was how he had solved it. Effortlessly, clearly, elegantly. The professor's eyes darted across the board, scanning every line with the intensity of someone desperate to find a mistake. Her jaw clenched tighter with each step she couldn't dispute. She had expected him to stumble, to drown in the complexity. Instead, he had swum through it with ease. A faint whistle broke the silence from the back of the hall. Another student muttered under their breath, "No way." The tension snapped and low murmurs filled the room. The tide had shifted. Daniel, however, didn't smile. He didn't bask in the attention. He simply dusted chalk from his fingers and walked back to his seat. He had proven what he needed to prove. For him, it was never about showing off. It was about truth, about accuracy, about not letting things slide just because it was easier. The professor stood rigid at the front of the room, her face composed, but her pride clearly wounded. She finally spoke, her words sharp and clipped. "Lucky guess," she muttered. A few students laughed quietly, not at Daniel, but at her, because everyone in that room knew the truth. That wasn't luck. That was mastery. And the battle between student and professor had only just begun. The professor's smirk had already faded after Daniel's last solution, but her pride wouldn't let her stop there. She picked up her chalk again, and this time the rhythm of her writing was different, faster, harder, more aggressive. She filled the board with symbols, not just 1 or 2 lines, but an equation that sprawled across half the surface. Nested integrals, complex limits, a differential component twisted inside the problem like a trap. The students shifted in their seats. They weren't stupid. They knew this wasn't standard material. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others leaned forward with nervous excitement. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't a teaching moment. It was a duel. When the professor stepped back, she turned toward Daniel, her arms crossed tightly, eyes glittering with challenge. "Since you have such a sharp mind," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "why don't you solve this one for us?" A few students laughed under their breath. Not out of cruelty toward Daniel, but out of disbelief. They knew she had just thrown him into the deep end. Nobody expected an undergraduate to solve a problem like this. It wasn't just difficult, it was meant to crush him. Daniel sat silently for a moment, staring at the sprawling problem. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't testing his skill anymore. She was testing his composure, his ability to withstand the weight of humiliation. If he faltered even once, she'd take back control of the class. But Daniel wasn't the type to shy away. He rose again, his notebook sliding shut with a quiet thump. His steps were steady, his face calm, though he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The professor stepped aside, the faintest curl of satisfaction on her lips as if she could already see him stumble. Daniel picked up the chalk. He studied the equation for a brief moment, not rushing, not hesitating, just letting the pieces click together in his mind. Then he started writing. The first few strokes drew murmurs. His lines were firm, deliberate, without pause. He wasn't guessing his way through. He wasn't trying to stall. He knew exactly where he was going. As the equation grew across the board, the murmurs died away. The scratching of chalk was the only sound in the lecture hall. Students leaned forward in their seats, some clutching their pens but forgetting to take notes. The professor's arms were still crossed, but her smirk had flattened into something tighter, less certain. Halfway through, Daniel turned slightly, his voice calm and almost casual. "I assume you want the solution in exponential form rather than trigonometric?" The professor froze, caught off guard. She didn't answer. Her silence said enough. Daniel simply nodded, turned back to the board, and kept going. His mind was 3 or 4 steps ahead of his hand, moving through each transformation, each simplification with the ease of someone who wasn't struggling at all. For him, it wasn't pressure, it was focus. Numbers and patterns flowed through his thoughts like water finding its natural path. The board filled with his work until finally, the last few lines settled neatly into place. He underlined the final answer, set the chalk down quietly, and stepped back. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, stretched, like the air itself was holding its breath. Students blinked at the board, then at Daniel, then back again. There it was, the solution, clean and undeniable. The professor moved closer, scanning line by line, her jaw tight. She wanted to find an error. She needed to find one. But every step was airtight. Every simplification, every transformation, every boxed result, it was flawless. A single whistle broke the silence from the back of the hall. Someone muttered, "No way." The quiet hum of whispers began spreading again, building like a wave. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply crossed his arms and waited, his expression calm. To him, this wasn't a victory lap. It was just the truth written in numbers. The professor finally straightened, her face carefully composed, though the tightness in her eyes betrayed her frustration. She cleared her throat. "You've skipped a step," she said sharply. Daniel's brow furrowed, though his voice stayed calm. "No, I didn't," her eyes narrowed. "Yes, you did." Daniel turned back to the board, scanning quickly. Then he pointed to the middle of the equation. "This step here, where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition, that's what you're referring to, right?" The professor didn't answer. Daniel nodded lightly, still calm. "I didn't skip it. I just did it mentally, because it was straightforward. But if you'd like, I can write it out." The class was silent again, their eyes bouncing between Daniel and the professor. There was no arrogance in his tone, no gloating, just a matter-of-fact explanation that left no room for argument. The professor's lips pressed into a thin line. Her fingers tightened slightly around the chalk she still held. Finally, she exhaled through her nose and muttered, "That won't be necessary." Daniel stepped away from the board and returned to his seat. But the energy in the room had shifted. Students were whispering to each other, exchanging glances, their eyes flicking toward Daniel with something different now. Admiration, maybe even awe. The professor stood at the front, her posture stiff, her grip on the desk betraying the frustration boiling beneath her calm surface. She had tried to put him in his place. Instead, she had lost control of the room, and for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't the one being watched with respect. News of Daniel's performance in class spread quickly across campus. By the end of the week, students he had never spoken to before were whispering his name in the hallways. Some offered him nods of respect. Others looked at him with curiosity, as if trying to figure out who this quiet genius really was. It didn't take long before the story reached beyond the lecture hall. The professor, however, refused to let the matter rest. The next lecture, she stood at the front of the class, her voice calm but her eyes sharp. "There's a mathematics symposium coming up next month," she announced, scanning the room before letting her gaze settle on Daniel. "It's a regional competition, fast-paced, rigorous, filled with some of the brightest students in the country. I believe Mr. Reed would benefit from participating." The way she said it sounded like an opportunity, but Daniel knew better. This wasn't just a chance, it was a test. She wanted to see him buckle under pressure, to prove that his classroom victories were nothing more than lucky moments. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll do it." Whispers filled the hall instantly. Some students looked impressed, others skeptical. But Daniel didn't care about the noise. He wasn't accepting the challenge for them or even for her. He was doing it for himself. The weeks leading up to the symposium were brutal. Daniel spent long nights in the library, surrounded by textbooks, half-empty coffee cups, and pages of scratchwork scattered across the table. He wasn't just reviewing problems. He was pushing himself into areas he'd never explored before. Every night the same thought returned. She expects me to fail, and I won't give her that satisfaction. Still, there were moments of doubt, moments when exhaustion clawed at him, when he wondered if he was in over his head. But each time, he reminded himself that this wasn't about proving he was the smartest in the room. It was about refusing to shrink when someone tried to put him down. The day of the competition arrived. The symposium hall at the University of Pennsylvania was enormous, its stage lit brightly under the gaze of professors, judges, and hundreds of spectators. Rows of students sat at individual desks, their faces tense, their papers blank, waiting for the clock to begin. Daniel sat among them, calm but alert. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in, but it didn't scare him. Somewhere in the crowd, he spotted his professor sitting with the audience, her face unreadable. She wasn't cheering for him. She wasn't supporting him. She was there to watch, to judge. The first round began, mental math under strict time limits. Some competitors froze, hesitating under the ticking clock. Daniel's answers came quickly, flowing from mind to hand without pause. The leaderboard shifted, his name steadily rising. The second round brought proofs, breaking down complex concepts step by step. This was Daniel's strength. Numbers didn't feel like work to him. They felt like a language, one he understood fluently. Each line of his proofs was clean, logical, undeniable. By the third round, only a handful of competitors remained in serious contention. Daniel was one of them. The atmosphere was heavy now, the silence punctuated only by the scratching of pens and the occasional shuffle of papers. The clock ticked down, ruthless and steady, and then came the final round. The last problem appeared on the screen above the stage. Gasps rippled through the audience. It wasn't just difficult, it was monstrous. Layers of integrals nested inside summations, a problem designed to test not just skill but endurance, patience, and clarity under crushing pressure. Daniel stared at it for a moment. Then he exhaled, steady and controlled, and began to write. His pen moved quickly, each stroke purposeful. The world around him faded, the judges, the audience, even the competitor beside him. All that existed was the problem and the rhythm of his own mind working through it. Beside him, the PhD student from MIT scribbled furiously, racing against the clock. They were neck and neck, each pushing themselves past the breaking point. The seconds dragged, heavy and merciless, and then Daniel saw it. A pattern hidden within the chaos, a shortcut that cut through the complexity like a blade. His hand moved faster, simplifying, condensing, building toward the inevitable solution. He underlined his final answer with a single stroke, just as the buzzer rang. His competitor was still writing. The judges moved quickly, scanning both solutions. The silence in the auditorium was unbearable. Students leaned forward in their seats, whispering. Daniel sat back in his chair, his breathing steady. He already knew. Finally, one judge stepped to the microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Daniel Reed. The hall erupted. Applause, cheers, gasps of disbelief. Students craned their necks to see him, some clapping, others shaking their heads in awe. But Daniel didn't raise his hands. He didn't celebrate. He simply closed his pen, sat quietly, and let the noise wash over him. For him, victory wasn't about the applause. It was about the truth. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found her, the professor. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. But for the first time, she gave him a small, reluctant nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, Daniel walked into the same lecture hall where it all began. He sat in his usual spot, quiet as always. The professor entered a few minutes later, heels clicking against the floor, her face composed. She set her books down, adjusted her glasses, and addressed the class. "Before we begin," she said, her voice steady, "I'd like to acknowledge yesterday's symposium. Daniel Reed took first place, defeating some of the brightest young mathematicians in the country. That is no small achievement. The room erupted in applause. Students turned to look at him, some smiling, some nodding with respect. Daniel just offered a small nod in return, his face calm. And then, as if nothing unusual had happened, the professor turned back to the board. "Now," she said, "let's begin today's lecture." It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a shower of praise. It was simple recognition, and somehow that meant more than anything else. Because in the end, Daniel hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He hadn't even needed to prove himself to the class. He had needed to prove something to himself. That he belonged. That he was capable. That no one, not even the most intimidating professor, could take that away from him. And in that quiet, unshakable truth, he had won.